It turns out that I've been passionate about building design tools since I was a graduate student. In fact, that was my dissertation topic, where I built an interactive sketching tool that would take what you could draw on paper and turn it into a functional prototype. And so I'm really happy to re-engage that area of work. And so today I'm going to talk about some recent contributions I've made in the area of design thinking tools. So let me just start by giving some background and motivation for my work. So a large part of my research addresses problems and opportunities that are triggered by the adoption of software tools for the conceptual phases of design. So domains of interest for me are in interaction design, graphic design, other forms of visual communication design, and more recently been thinking about technical writing and programming more from a creative perspective. When I say conceptual phase, what I mean is anything that precedes implementation. So it could be example finding, it could be idea generation, it could be selection and refinement. The use of software tools for the conceptual phases of design is problematic. There's a lot of friction. And the reason why is that for 40 years, we have designed tools from the perspective of productivity. Whereas for design, which is a canonical form of a creative task, we need to think about how we design them from the perspective of creativity. And that gap between productivity and creativity is really important to close. There are many compelling reasons, but let me give you the one that I think is convincing, at least to me. This comes from Richard Florida's book that he boldly calls The Rise of the Creative Class. You may have read this one. But in that book, he reports that about 1/3 of the national workforce is engaged in design and other forms of creative work. And that further enabling that creative class is vital to our economic and social prosperity. One way to do that is to extend and enhance tools that that creative class has available to work with. And so I try to do this by bridging three themes. One is what I call making, and that tries to combine computer science with HCI and reflects my interest in building tools from an understanding of human behavior. The second is creativity, and this refers both to the theory and the practice of design and other forms of creative work. And theories of reflection, brainstorming, and in particular creative cognition have had a large influence on what I do. And it's really interesting that the past 5 to 10 years, the CHI community has really engaged that literature. And the last one is crowds. And this refers to both online communities and crowd computing. And I got interested in this actually from my sabbatical in 2008 when I went to Microsoft Research. And I had a really amazing opportunity to study one of their innovation communities inside the organization. And it's like, wow, this is really amazing. And I wanted to make that more of a main part of my research. That's what sabbaticals are for. So I mapped around the perimeter my recent publications and work that I've done. And I try to push my work at the intersection of those themes because I think that's where we can make the most interesting contributions. And so today I'll talk about the four around the top. And the one thing I want to say, when I go through the talk, I'm simply going to describe the people that use our tools as users and not necessarily try to tease apart if it's an expert or a novice or a non-designer doing design work. I'll just say user. If it matters, I'll try to make the distinction. So let's get started on the first one. The first project I want to describe involves helping users work more effectively with multiple ideas during the conceptual phases of design. When you tackle almost any creative task, what is the first instruction that you get? Generate as many ideas as you can. We've known that for a really long time. So for example, here, a designer responded with multiple sketches in response to a given design problem in, say, product design. The theoretical basis for that goes back really far. It goes back to Osborne's work on applied imagination, where he argued that the best ideas come at the tail end of idea generation. So if you want to get to the really good ideas, then you have to generate many ideas. The problem is that this behavior is not well supported in existing design tools or the practice of using those tools. So for instance, on the left, this is kind of the dominant model in digital drawing tools where they just assume that you're going to work with a document model and you just map your alternatives to different file names that are aptly named, concept 1, concept 2, concept 3, and so forth. And in research, the way that we think about working with multiple ideas, for example, could be done through a tab interface. And so this is an example from the juxtapose system that Bjorn Hartman and Scott Klimmer did here. The problem, though, is that other researchers argue is that these types of representations hinder interpretation and the projection of meaning. What the heck does that mean, right? Let me give you an example. So take either of those two representations. Which is the leading alternative? Which one is favored? Which one was tried but no longer in contention? And which ones are in between? We can't even see all the ideas anymore. I mean, it's small, but it's an important part of the creative process. And so what I wanted to do is try to bring that back as best as I could. And so my approach was to explore a new model I called interactive spatial maps. And the concept was implemented as part of a prototype sketching application. And the larger window is just a very crude approximation of what you would get in a digital drawing tool. And our spatial maps is in the lower right. And it runs as a floating window. It can be on your primary display, or if you want to, you can move it to a secondary display if you have one. And the key idea of the spatial maps is that we allow you to directly manipulate the representations on a zoomable workspace. And so you can project meaning by using the dimensions of both space and scale. So for example, the user here has a number of alternatives. And the one that they think is favored at the moment, they can scale it, make it larger, and position it near the center. And the one that maybe they tried but didn't necessarily like, they can scale it down and position it away, and the others are somewhat in between. So when you look at the workspace relative to what I showed before, you should get an immediate intuitive sense as to how they're thinking about the design situation, and you can see all the ideas at once. So let me just show you a little video clip of this in action.
Designer is working on a tablet PC running the TeamStorm client software. The client interface allows the designer to freely sketch on multiple canvases for rapid externalization of creative ideas. Standard editing features such as zooming and editing control are supported. Every new idea is drawn within a new canvas, and we allow users to have as many canvases as they want. Ideas are managed through a resizable, zoomable floating workspace window that allows for spatial arrangement and resizing of canvases as they come in and out of favor. Selecting a canvas in the workspace makes it the focus of the editing region. A colored viewfinder appears on the canvas in the workspace to show the scope of the user's editing. This color corresponds to the color of the border around the main sketching window.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of how it works. And we did an evaluation, and I wanted to compare it to how it works with relative to a tab interface that's represented, say, in Microsoft OneNote, and a layered canvas that's represented in Photoshop. So just briefly, our procedure with it was a within subjects design. We had 18 users, all trained in some form of visual design. And they used all three tools. So every person used one of the three tools with one task, next tool, different task, and so forth. And we had a number of different measures. We measured process outcomes, so the number of ideas, the number of categories ideas, the switches between the ideas. We measured strategies that they used for how they worked with the ideas during the task. We measured their preferences, and we got qualitative feedback. And we had a lot of interesting findings, and if you want to read about all of them, you can look at our GI 2010 paper. It's one of my all-time favorite papers. And let me just give you the highlights. So one of the highlights was that users actively organize and reflect during the idea generation task. It was a core part of generating ideas. And so the idea sets weren't passive, they weren't an archive. People actively engaged them throughout the task to help them come up with more ideas. I thought that was really interesting. When they used our tool, for example, they had about 10 reflections where they look at the entire idea set at once, and 12 organizational interactions where they'd map either the idea onto space or scale. And that was more than what they would do with the other two tools. And my interpretation was that is that there's a need to engage those idea sets, and when you give people the opportunity to do it, they'll take advantage of it. But they also wanted more. And so a couple of the ideas that we got through the qualitative feedback was that they wanted more ways to engage that idea set. And so we went back and extended the tool to offer a grid-based view. We could look at all the ideas at the same scale, and a time-based view, so you could look at the evolution of your ideas over time, and you could do color-coded tags that you would attach to the idea, and you could toggle their visibility. Okay, so they wanted different ways to look at that set of ideas. Because we allowed them to directly manipulate and organize and reflect on the ideas, there's a very strong preference for spatial maps. And maybe the biggest outcome of the study was that we showed that spatial maps is a viable approach and an effective approach for working with ideas. And so I would love to see this be extended and implemented in the growing class of digital drawing tools that are now available through app stores as well as just on the web. But I also think there's a lot of opportunity to really dig deeper into how people do exploratory work in, say, areas of technical writing and programming. And I know this has been around for a really long time, but there's a lot more that we can do in this space. And I hope to engage some of that work in the future. But one of the things that really piqued my interest during this project was this notion of reflection, about how people look back to engage with things that they've done and try to extract meaning from it. And that led me to Don Schoen's work. He has a number of theories of reflection, and reflection is a theory of practice. And he developed that theory of practice through observations of how architectural designers work in practice. He talks about many different granularities of reflection, but the one that I liked the most was reflection on action. It's intentional, critical thinking about prior work to learn from your experience and to project that into the future. So if you've ever looked back at, say, a talk or a Chi paper to think about what you might do next, you've engaged in reflection on action. Okay, and I'm just going to call that reflection for this talk. And I do it all the time. I actually did it for this talk. I did it for the last paper, and so forth. Reflection typically benefits from having a representation of design process. And designers often construct their own representations through different organizational and naming strategies. So this is just an example of one that we uncovered from a study that we did. So in this case, they use numbers to indicate project priority. They use letters to indicate status. They have highlights to indicate unmet dependencies. And they organize iterations using folder structures. It's not that the naming schemes are bad. It's just that the hierarchical representation doesn't reveal the relationships in a way that's meaningful to the user. So what did they learn from that project? What was a proud moment? What was a critical incident? And what I'm arguing is that you can't really know because it doesn't come out of the visualization or the representation. Is it short?
So with other representations, do you see that these things become explicit, or is this just tacit knowledge?
That's where I'm going to go.
Okay.
We're going to try to make it explicit because what really I loved Schoen's theory, but what sort of bothered me about it is it seemed very tacit and very implicit. And I wanted to think about what if we could actually make that explicit in a visualization so that people can engage this in a more direct way.
So I'm asking a slightly different question, which is, have you seen in other domains before you left in that people do have a regular practice of this kind of reflection?
Yes, we actually predicated what I'm about to show you on a number of interviews and studies that we did and found that people actually do engage. In fact, his whole book is dedicated to trying to communicate that people do this. And it's a very important part of how people work in the design profession. Yeah. Okay, and I would argue that representation design process that have built in research also don't necessarily answer those questions. And so one very nice tool was done by Mendels and others in Chi 2011 called Freed. It was a very nice visualization that you can construct by hand. And once you had the visualization, you can engage in reflection. The problem is the cost of construction works against the utility of the visualization. And others, visualizations for state-based design histories and exploratory behavior, very nice contributions, but they didn't really target reflective behavior, and that's what I wanted to do. And so we created a tool called Reflection Space, and the key innovation of Reflection Space is that it provides a condensed visualization of design process that allows you to engage with the process directly. It was predicated on results from interviews that we had with graphic, product, and architectural designers. So let me just take you through what you see. On the y-axis, we have a number of channels. It's called research, inspiration, concepts, prototype, and communication as an attempt to capture a generalized design process. If you don't like that, that's fine. You can change it and configure it in the tool. Every filled circle is a representation of an artifact. It could be a concept sketch, it could be an AutoCAD prototype, it could be an example that you found on the web. And you can select them and look at the thumbnails and open them up for editing. On the x-axis, that is time. And we cluster the artifacts based upon creation time. We use creation time because it gives us a stable representation. Once I place it, it stays there as across implications of the tool. So just to put this in context, what you're looking at is a visualization of process of an architectural designer who was working to remodel the dome of the observatory at our institution. And what you notice is they start with some background research. In this case, it was lighting conditions. They moved on to have a couple of bursts of inspirational example flying. In this case, it was domes from around the world. The second burst was coincided with some concept sketches that they drew, followed by some AutoCAD prototypes that they created. And there was continued communication with the supervisor and peers throughout. And the point that I want to make is that you can read and tell stories about process with this type of visualization that you cannot do with a file-centric approach. One of our challenges, though, is we really wanted to make this as low cost as we possibly could. And so the way that we approached this problem is that we tried to map your organizational strategy to our visualization. And we used things such as your file names, your file extensions, your folder hierarchies, your folder names, as well as the creation times. Okay? And the rules are a bit more complex than what we have here, but the basic idea was you could say something like, well, if your file is in or is a PDF or a document that ends with .doc and it's in user, research, background, or sort combination, then categorize it as research in our tool. Okay? And so the more closely aligned the way that you organize is with what we expect, then the lower the cost of creating the visualization. If you have no organizational strategy whatsoever, then I would have to concede that I probably can't help you. If we map it and we get it wrong, you can move it around in the tool, and that would actually stay persistent. Okay, so one of the things that you can do with the tool is you can capture stories. And the way that you capture stories is you select the icon in the upper right, and you can put it into what we call the reflection channel. Once you do that, the system prompts you to associate a number of artifacts with that story. Okay? And a story can be anything that is memorable to you as a designer. It can be a proud moment. It can be a lesson learned. It could be a critical incident. But what we're trying to do is make it explicit in the visualization so you can revisit it later on. So you get prompted, you can add and associate the artifacts. And you can put as many in there as you want. And actually one of my favorite features of the tool is you can come back later on and export that into a PowerPoint presentation to share some of those lessons learned with colleagues. You can also mark your favorite materials. And so if you have an artifact that you're particularly proud of, you think is inspirational, you want to revisit for any reason, you can mark it, and we do it with a star, so you can pick as many as you want. And it makes it pop out of the visualization, so you can revisit it very quickly later on. And the final thing that I'll share with you, the tool actually does much more than this, but I'll share one other goal that we had based upon the results of interviews that we did, is that they wanted to look at the distribution of effort. And this was a very challenging problem because we didn't want to have to instrument every application that one uses to record, say, editing time. And so the way that we approached the problem is that we looked at the changes to the modification date at the level of the file system. And so our assumption was that every time you do a save, it changes the modification date. And you're not going to do a save unless you made a meaningful change. And so basically what we're doing is we're counting the number of times that you essentially save that artifact. We collect that data for everything that's in the system, we store it, and then we rank it per channel. And we display the ones that are at the top 10%, chosen arbitrarily. You can change it if you want, as an unfilled circle, so that you can make it easily identifiable in the visualization. So just to illustrate why that might be interesting, is here's one that there was a lot of effort made to that particular concept, and it was very early in the process. So that could indicate premature commitment to a concept, and that might warrant a change in process or at least a discussion as to why that was the case. So we did an evaluation of this, and we had 7 users, all trained in either graphic or architectural design. And the way that worked is that they gave us 2 projects that they felt were similar in size and scope. We built our representation in our system for them because we wanted to test the utility of the visualization first, not get too caught up in whether or not the mapping was perfect. And then we just recreated their own representation in the lab. They would come in, and we would engage them in a bit of storytelling. And so they would just talk about the project by itself, no representation, and then with one of the 2 representations, other project, other representation, and we compared the differences. In terms of the measured outcomes, they would tell more and longer stories when they used our tool in terms of word count than with other representation. And they rated it better for telling stories, noticing patterns, estimating effort, and just overall preference. So it's not definitive because the sample size was small. It was a single study, but it's at least promising. Other interesting things that we found is that they wanted to mark iterations, decisions, and key milestones in that reflection channel. So you can imagine having a more kind of elaborate visual vocabulary of things that you could store there. And another thing that we found is that they would be more careful with the naming. If they knew that the visualization was based upon their strategy for how they organize things, then they might change that because they knew that that would be impacting that visualization that would be created. And the other things, there's a lot of enthusiasm. They were really interested in having a visualization that allowed them to engage in explicit acts of reflection. And that made me really excited. And so that got me to think a lot about how you might use this in the future. And so one of the things is everybody asked me to put my data in the cloud. So what if I did that? What if I put all design artifacts in the cloud? And what I'm going to argue is that that could make actually building that type of visualization really easy. And you could share it, which would be really interesting to me to make it more social. And the reason I think it might make it interesting is suddenly you have access to a very large corpus of organizational strategies that you didn't have before. And so you could analyze that corpus of data, and you could try to build very robust mappings, and then construct that type of visualization as a value add and not just use it as a passive storage archive. So I think that could be really interesting moving forward. So reflection space was built for an individual user, but we know that design is as much of a social process as it is an individual effort. One of the things that makes design a social process is that you often have to get feedback on your ideas. And so let me just illustrate with an example why this is such an important component of design. I can summarize this as JCPenney had a really great idea for a tea kettle. Unfortunately, it didn't work out so well for them. And it's somewhat of an amusing example, but the reality was this was a national embarrassment for JCPenney. They had to take this tea kettle off all the shelves. They had to issue a public apology. They got a lot of negative press, and they wound up in my talk. And so I think this is a really interesting example because it highlights one of the key reasons why you need feedback in design. And that's to compare intention to perception. And so you as a designer often always have an intent. What is it you're trying to communicate? And other people may or may not get that perception. It's not like when you write a paper and you're trying to say something and you think it's unassailable. You give it to your advisor and it comes back with all red ink. And you're like, how could you not possibly get what I was trying to say? And so it's that difference between intent and perception. And I would argue that good feedback is necessary, but not always easy. And so there are a number of known strategies for getting feedback. I mean, you can organize a critique, you can ask peers, you can submit to an online community, but they have both benefits and limitations. And so when you organize a critique, it's very heavyweight. It's unlikely you're going to do that for day-to-day decision making. And if you're not familiar with the kind of design domain, to have a training in design, it's probably unlikely that you're even familiar with that technique at all. You can informally ask peers, but we know through research that the feedback that comes back is often overly positive. You might be reluctant to share in the first place due to the fear of criticism. And my own work has shown that you might have a fear of interrupting other people's work. You could submit it to an online community, but the research results on this don't really paint a very rosy picture. And so the feedback that you get often is very limited in terms of the quantity, and it's relatively shallow. So you get things like, wow, nice job, way to go, versus, oh, wow, that's really not very good. And that's really not what people want to engage with and try to get the insights into improving their design. So I wanted to think more about how crowds might be engaged to offer deeper, more meaningful feedback. And I drew a lot of inspiration from work that Stephen Dow and Liz Gerber did. And what they had done is they used crowds to do A/B testing, to collect preferences for which one you like, A versus B. And then as a designer, you can get that signal and try to figure out what decision that you want to make. And so I love this idea, but I wanted to try to push it a bit further and think about how we could get crowds to provide more deeper, more meaningful feedback. The challenge is that crowds don't really have any expertise in design. So if I show you an idea and I say, what do you think of it? What do I expect somebody to say who doesn't have training in that discipline? Okay, so that was a challenge. But if I asked the question in a different way, and I said, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you see that design? What's the first thing that you notice? How is my communication goal coming through to you? Then you can tell me your reaction. And that's something that you can control. And that insight led to a system that we called Voyant, which is a play on the word clairvoyant, helping you to see. And this is a system that leverages crowd workers, a non-expert crowd, to provide feedback on a visual design. And that feedback is primarily perception-oriented feedback. And the design of the system was predicated on the results of interviews that we did with people who had a wide spectrum of design experience, from non-designers just doing design work, all the way to experts. And we asked them, if you had a large audience of non-experts, what would you want to ask them? And from their responses, we were able to extract 5 themes, and we implemented those into the tool. And so you can get elements. This is literally what people can see in the design. What first notice, so what people actually see first, and so establishing part of the visual hierarchy. Impressions, so what's the first word or phrase that comes to mind when you look at the design. Guidelines, so we started with what's known as the CRAP humorously principles, but contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. And what you would get with that is just a rating of 1 to 7 about how well people felt like your design was adhering to each of those principles, and very similar with the goals. So goals are about your communication goals. Again, you get a rating from 1 to 7. So the way that it works is that you go to a publicly accessible website. It's called crowdfeedback.me. If you have your computer open, you can go there now. You upload your design image, and here what you have is a poster design that was done as a student design project. And the idea here was to try to engage customers in a restaurant to try a new smoothie station, so that we put over the top and try to help them engage with that. Okay, so you try a new drink, grab attention. You can configure your audience. So you can configure it based upon age, location, gender, and try to match that audience to the intended audience that you have for the design. You can configure which of the types of feedback that you want, and for some of them you can add additional parameters. So if you configure the goals, for instance, the system would prompt you to enter in, with as few words as possible, make it accessible to a layperson. What is your communication goal for the design? You can enter as many as you want. Once you click Submit, it will decompose that task into a series of microtasks and put it onto Mechanical Turk. And the workers are asked to do 3 things, very simple. First, give us your reaction. And so if it's the task about impression, is tell us the first word or the phrase that comes to mind when you look at that design. If it's a goal or a guideline, it's give us a rating on a scale of 1 to 7 of how well you think that design meets that rating or meets that guideline or goal. And the second thing is do an annotation. So point out the elements in the visual design that relate to your reaction that you had. And the third thing, which is optional, is you can offer an explanation of why you gave the reaction and the annotation that you did. And so we do this for a large number of people, and then we aggregate and present the results back to the user. And you get a visualization that looks something like this. This is the one for impressions. And if you're the user, this is what you see. Okay? And so in this case, for impressions, we do the representation as a word cloud. And so all 5 types of feedback followed the same pattern. We give you an overview representation. We give you the markers on the design that associate with each of the pieces of feedback, and then the explanations. So here, for example, you can select the different words in the word cloud and see which elements of your design went with that. Alternatively, you can come over to the design and look at the markers and select a subset and see which words were associated with those markers. So this is all about intention versus perception. And so the person who created this design found a number of interesting things from this. So first of all, is color, colorful, retro, fresh? Is that really what you're trying to communicate? One of the interesting things that came out of the word cloud was the word sunny. And it turns out this was because of this element here. She had no idea that people were going to associate that with the sun. It looks like the sun to me, but it wasn't intentional on her part. Another thing that was really interesting that she learned from the feedback was people were associating the words strawberry, apple, and juice with the colors in the poster. And she didn't really make that intentional. And what she discovered was that she could literally make people taste her design by choosing the appropriate colors. And so with a very simple set of feedback, she was learning really interesting things about what she was communicating, what she was not communicating, and how she might improve that. Another set of feedback that you get is the ratings of communication goals. And here the goals that were entered were trying a new drink and grabbing attention. Okay, so again, this is supposed to be above like a smoothie station in a restaurant and try to get people to come over and try it. With this part, you get a data visualization that is an interactive bar chart. Okay, and it assesses how well you're meeting your goals. So in this case, they did relatively well in both, but trying a new drink didn't rate as high as grabbing attention. And so you could maybe sharpen that particular goal on the next iteration. The other thing, the bar chart is interactive. And so you can select different bars or subsets. And you can do this to look at some interesting patterns that we've noticed. And so, for example, if you had a bimodal distribution where certain people really like something and others don't, you can compare and contrast that feedback. Now, there are additional types of feedback. You get elements and first notice and guidelines, and it's very similar in terms of the data representation and the interactions that you have. And I would just refer you to the paper we have forthcoming on this, and let me just talk a bit about the evaluation. What I was really interested in the evaluation is, can you actually learn anything about this feedback about your design? Okay, so we collected 8 in-progress designs, and it ran kind of the gamut. We had magazine covers, we had 3D renderings, we had graphic logos, we have web page designs. And we worked with each of those people who created the designs to understand their goals. We took their goals, we took their designs, we uploaded it into our system. And once we had the feedback, we asked them to come back, and we talked about what they could learn as they walked through that feedback on their own idea. So I just want to share with you one anecdote that kind of exemplifies what we found. And so in this case, this was a 3D rendering that the person who created it wanted to communicate 2 things. They wanted to communicate Chinese style, and they wanted to communicate that it was a teapot. Okay? And what they found from the feedback, both from the impressions, which are not shown, and from the goals, which are shown, is that it didn't really communicate Chinese style very well, and it didn't really communicate a teapot. People actually perceived it as a coffee pot. And so based upon digging into the data and digging into the explanations, they decided they would make 2 changes. One is they would add teacups to try to convey better that it's a tea kettle and not a coffee pot. And the second was to put maybe like a dragon pattern to better communicate Chinese style. Okay, so the point is that everybody learned something about their design. And in many cases, it wasn't just one set of feedback, it was the collection of things where they could synthesize, interesting ideas. Okay, well, we also tracked how much it cost and how long it took. In terms of cost, it was about $10, and that was perceived as a fair trade-off because they didn't have to organize a critique or repeatedly interrupt peers. We did absolutely no optimization, and so it's really interesting to think about that as an upper bound. How good could we do if we started to optimize cost, to optimize quality, and to optimize time? The second thing was we really emphasize finding problems. And I'm okay with that because if finding problems is a significant outcome with the work. How do you iterate if you don't know what you're trying to address? Very hard to do. But it is interesting to think about how you might engage the crowd to help brainstorm solutions. So let me just kind of look forward with this project a little bit. What if I could make the feedback both fast and affordable? And so I could go through and optimize the cost by doing a better job of structuring my workflows. And I can use Michael's techniques, such as the retainer model, to make it also really fast. And by fast, I mean, what if I could give this to you like 3 to 4 times a day? What would be the impact on design process if I could do that? I mean, I don't know, but I think it would be really, really interesting to think about how this is going to be integrated into the creative workflow. And another thing, looking forward, what if I was to aggregate and collect all of the data that you've got across all iterations and all projects that you've ever done? And I know a little bit about the data. I know that they have word clouds. I know they have bar charts. It's connected to the design. I got explanations. I got the markers, right? What if I collected that over a long period of time and I created a visualization of that? What could you as a designer, what could you learn from that? What else could you do with that? I think that's a really interesting thing. Gilbert, is this a short one?
Yeah, the last slide with the teapot.
Okay.
That's sort of interesting. Is it like both of the criteria that it's a teapot and that it's Chinese style seem like depends who you're asking. It's like who the crowd is.
Sure.
I don't know. At least
Yeah.
like if you're someone who's in computer graphics at all, you're going to go, of course that's a teapot.
Well, I'm going to guess. I haven't been close enough to that, but I'm going to guess that was a computer graphics student. That might have been one of their projects.
Right.
So yeah, but you know, it's subjective, but it's okay. I mean, that was meaningful to the person who created the design.
Well, no, I mean in the sense of who the people are who are doing the assessment and who your audience is and how that, okay, I want it to look Chinese style, but to who? To someone
So
in China or in the US?
Well, sure. And so one of the really cool things about this, we haven't done it yet, but I would love to try to separate out the audience. And so right now, all the audience comes back as being the same. And there's many different ways that one wants to slice that audience. And so it could be that I just separate based upon culture, the age, the gender. But one of the things that's really interesting is how do I separate on expertise? One of the challenges here, I think, is that crowd work often devalues expertise. Some people are much better at this type of task than others. So how would I differentially weigh what people who are really good at that type of task are, especially with the goals and the guidelines, versus those who are not? Because right now we weigh them the same. I just don't think that's fair. Yeah, okay, but good question. Okay, so the feedback from Voyant helps the individual make decisions on a design. But you know, decisions are often made in a group setting, not necessarily by the individual. In online communities, for example, the design discussions, or it's the community that often engages in design thinking in the discussions. And I was really interested in how that transpires. You have people who have never met and probably never will. They're using a fairly impoverished interface, which is the web forum, to engage in ideation about interesting design problems. So how does that work? How does it unfold? And I really wanted to probe deeper about that. One of the things that we had to do was pick a community that we wanted to study. And we selected Drupal. It's a very well-known, very successful open source content management system. It has about 500,000 websites that have been created with Drupal. It has roughly an equal number of people that have registered to contribute to that project. The design discussions that relate to the user interface happen in this issue queue. So if you have a feature request or a usability problem that you want to report, you put it into the issue queue. And other community members can come and join and talk about the issue, offer up concrete proposals for how to solve it, engage in deliberation. And then eventually, if things go well, you can pick one and push it into the product. And so we also needed to think about how we wanted to study those particular discussions. And we chose the lens of what's called consensus building. Consensus building is a distinct form of decision making where you value the social process of the discussion as much as the final outcome. And the consensus is often determined to be reached when you have a decision and everybody can live with it. We thought that was an interesting lens to look at because the design discussions often exhibit conflict due to people advocating strongly for their ideas, and it's therefore really important for those discussions to unfold in a way that is respectful, respectful and courteous, because the community depends upon people coming back and continuing to communicate and contribute to that community. And so we first just wanted to quantify how many of those discussions actually reach consensus, okay? So we analyzed a fairly large corpus of the data, a number of design discussions, messages, patches, and contributors. We had a very surprising finding. About 42% of the UI design discussions do not reach consensus. It's a very significant finding because of all the potential consequences. So all the missed opportunities to improve the product, all the effort that gets wasted into building the ideas, the deliberation, and it doesn't go anywhere. And one of the problems is that that could cause people to leave the community and not come back. And it's actually not just Drupal. Wikipedia has the same problem. So this is an article from a recent Wall Street Journal article where they argue that there's a mass exodus of people from Wikipedia. And one of the problems is that people get very frustrated with the decision-making that happens. So they make a change and it gets reverted. They don't understand why. So if you're frustrated with it, you can just leave and not come back. And it's very easy to leave, and that's happening. And so one of the really interesting things about this, though, when I looked at that graph, is that maybe the right metric for consensus building is not whether or not you reach an agreeable solution. It's whether you reduce the outflow of people from the community. That's a very different way of thinking about consensus building in communities than we have today. Now, there are many reasons why the discussions may not reach consensus, but we think part of the reason is that the web forums that people use have no mechanism for consensus building at all. So we wanted to explore, what would it mean from a technical side in terms of the interface to actually build in features that support consensus. This is a really challenging problem. And so we're guided by two high-level principles. One is that we wanted to embed feasible and sound strategies into the interface. And our approach was to first enumerate many different strategies that we could locate in the literature, both from the theory and the practice of consensus. And then we wanted to select a subset of those that we felt were feasible and that would have utility for our tool. Yet you have to be realistic. I mean, we're creating a tool. We're not creating a human moderator. And so maybe as the first step, what we thought is let's try to give people a better discussion experience. And maybe in the future, we can try to lead and convert those discussions to a consensus. But maybe that wouldn't be a goal we could reach in the near term. And we wanted to integrate into the existing community. And this also is a really difficult challenge. But all the work in Drupal, it happens in that issue queue. It's where the designers are. It's where the developers are. It's where all the work gets done. And so we wanted to have an impact on the community and learn and discover principles of consensus through authentic use, as opposed to just creating a one-off interface that people would use, say, in the lab. OK, so based on those goals, we developed a system called Proceed. It's a script. It runs inside the client browser. And what it does, it basically rewrites the HTML with the Drupal server. But we also use our own server to track certain state information that we need to render the interface the way that we do. And so what you're looking at here, and the first thing I want to point out is on kind of the right side, this is the actual discussion in the Drupal community. We do not modify it at all. The interface works with any discussion in that community that you want to go look at and participate in. What we do is we basically wrap around the top and along the left. And so we have three different pages that we offer. The home page is what you see here, what we call an idea page, which I'll show, and an invitation page, which I'll show. One of the basic elements of consensus is you have to know what's going on in the discussion. So on the left panel, we give you a number of lenses to help you do that. We help you filter comments based upon the experience of the person who submitted the comment, community endorsement, so what other people say is an interesting discussion point, conversational behavior, so kind of a rapid back and forth between two people, and the content in terms of which messages have ideas and which have patches. And so the benefit is that you can use those lenses to help track and revisit key points of the discussion. A second strategy is including users who can help contribute to moving that discussion forward. And the way that we do this is through the invite page, and we generate a list of all the community members, and we show how they score on different criteria that we know to be important for consensus in the domain. And so we talk about how much experience they've had in the community, the number of patches that they contributed, how many threads that they've participated in that have been closed or as a proxy for consensus, and the number of interactions they've had with people in the current ongoing discussion. And so you can use this to help fill perceived gaps. And so if you're in a discussion and you wish that you had more experienced participants, you can come to this page and look at those who have more experience than what you guys have currently, and you can find those who have bridges to people who are already engaged in the discussion. Because one is that we'll create an opportunity maybe to bring them in. And second, we know that it's much easier to reach consensus with people that we know than people that we don't. I want to talk about the idea-centric page, but first I want to tell you about how do we know about ideas. And so we have a very clever strategy. We ask. And so what we do is we rewrite the HTML on the page for authoring a comment. And we inject a very small amount of input that we request when you're authoring that comment. We simply ask, does this comment propose a concrete idea? If not, does it refer to an idea? And if so, which comment number does it go with? And then tell us your disposition. Do you strongly object up to strongly support the idea that you're referring to? Now, this has been a very long thread of research in CSCW work, where basically what we say is that if you just give us a little bit of input, we can render the discussion better for you. The problem, however, is that it's easy to fall into the trap to over-engineer the system. Think design rationale systems, for instance, where without any kind of bound on what you're asking for the structured input, you just go too far, it becomes too cumbersome to use. And so we think this is interesting because the community puts a constraint on us to think very carefully about how much input we're actually going to ask for fear of a backlash from the community members themselves. Okay, so this is all of the input that we request initially for the ideas. And then we can do some interesting things with it. Is it short?
Yeah,
okay.
Is this only appear for me if I have an extension installed? Or is this
yes, you must install our extension to get this. If you don't install our extension, you would just see it the way that you always would see it. Okay?
So it's not going to show up for everyone in the community?
You have to go get it and put it into your browser. Yeah. So assuming that the users will give us that small amount of input, then we can render what we call an idea-centric page. And this is trying to organize the ideas or organize the discussion around the ideas. And again, that's one of the tenets of doing consensus building. It's really to focus on the idea proposals. So on the left is you get the concrete proposals that were attached to what people said were an idea. You get the status. You get a set of user-defined criteria, which I'll come back to. And you get a set of comments that are organized in different channels. And so the top one is supportive comments. The middle one is neutral comments. And the bottom one are what we call constructive comments, which is a polite way of saying it's a critical comment. And so what you can see is that you can look for ideas that need further attention. You can look for conflict. You can look for things that already have good support and things that have the lack of support. And we do one other thing. If you give me an extreme position, either I really don't like this, or I object to it strongly, or I strongly support it, we render it as a slightly larger circle to call attention to it by the other community members and give you a sense that you have a stronger voice in the discussion. Okay, you can establish criteria, and the way you do the criteria is you select the icon here next to the criteria column, and then it prompts you with the dialog, and you can either modify what's there, or you can add an additional set. So if you add another piece of criteria, it gets replicated for every idea in that same column. And what you end up with is criteria that's user-defined, it's visually persistent, and it's interactive. And so if you wanted to rate how an idea adheres to one of the criteria, you can do that with a slider. And anybody in the community can do this. The system prompts you to enter a comment with it to create accountability. So it's unlikely that you're going to make a modification unless you feel strongly about that change should happen. The last one that I'm going to talk about, that we actually do more than this, is promoting a constructive tone. And so our tool realizes this strategy in two ways. First, when a comment is authored, the system highlights all of the negative words. Okay? We don't make any interpretation. We're not trying to censor people. We simply highlight what those words are according to Linguistic Inquiry Toolkit, or LIWC. And we simply remind you why it's a good thing to have a constructive tone. And you can just choose to go forward and post it as is, or you might go back and revise it. Okay? It's up to you. And the second way is to promote a constructive tone is that we have a constraint in the system. So it's that when you have a new idea, the first comment has to be supportive. And so we try to extract the good of an idea before people can start making critical comments on it. And this should be familiar to everybody. If you're in a face-to-face discussion and you submit an idea and it immediately gets attacked, How does that make you feel? You probably disengage. And here the problem with disengagement is you leave the community and you don't come back. And remember that Wikipedia graph? That's the problem. Okay, so it's an early prototype. We know that we have a lot more work to do. But we had it to the point where we could actually get some feedback from the community members themselves. And so the way that we did this is we did it as a walkthrough. We found some active discussions that had some tension in them, where people were advocating strongly for their ideas. And we downloaded those discussions and we mirrored them on our server, and we constructed and rendered that discussion in our tool. We invited people who were participating in those discussions to come participate in our study. And for those who responded in the affirmative, we gave them our script, asked them to the install. We gave them a link to their own discussion so they could see it, and we gave them a set of tasks to experience the different key features of the system. And so, overall, we got very favorable reactions from the community members, which I was really excited about. And their favorite aspects were the idea-centric and views, and the criteria lists were the things they liked the most. And in terms of their subjective responses, they rated our tool as being more effective for consensus building than the current web forum that they use. And I know that's not definitive, but it's at least promising. Another couple interesting things that we found is that they desire minimal change. They have such a way of working now that they're just really attached to it. They're very resistant to change. And so the idea is that you can inject this type of tool with a very small delta over what they do now, and then try to grow it over time. The second thing that we found is they really wanted buy-in. I mean, that community is all about buy-in and contributing, right? So the recommendation that they had to us was to open a discussion about the tool, about consensus building in general, and invite the community to come talk about it. And that's exactly what we've done. And we're just now trying to look at where that discussion is heading and starting to collect some data. And looking forward, I mean, one of the things I think is really intellectually challenging is how do you measure the impact of a tool like this in a community? And when I first approached the problem, I was thinking, wow, we should really just be looking at the number of discussions that now reach consensus that didn't before. But when I started looking at the data and looking at the graphs of, say, Wikipedia, it started to think about, well, maybe that's not the right metric after all. Maybe what we should really be looking at is whether or not we reduce the outflows of volunteers from this type of community. And maybe there's other metrics that we can use too. Okay, so let me offer a couple of pathways forward for future work, and then I will conclude. So the first pathway I want to talk about is I want to make an argument that ideas used to be difficult to get. And that really spawned 40 years of research into how we do better idea generation. But now I want to argue that the world has changed, and ideas are now cheap. And one of the reasons that we're cheap is because we can engage crowds. So for example, this is from Starbucks, mystarbucksideas.com website. And what they do is they engage the crowd to give them ideas for how they might improve products or consumer experiences. And people do engage with that. It generates about 1,000 ideas a month, if not more. And so what I'm arguing is that the problem is no longer that we don't have enough ideas, we have too many. And so future design tools, especially those that try to engage with the crowd, need to think more about idea selection and not just idea generation. And maybe that's just a stepping stone to something even bigger, where we really think about how crowds change the creative workflow throughout. And I think that's something very interesting to think about in the future. We also want to think about how do we help people select the best or the most innovative idea and overcome the psychological bias of always choosing the safest or the most familiar idea, which we know happens a lot. And the second pathway I want to talk about just briefly is the motivation of creative effort. So I'm a really big fan of Teresa Amabille's work, who argues that intrinsic motivation is one of three key ingredients for creative work. Look, I can give you examples, I can give you feedback, I can give you spatial maps, but unless you're motivated to translate that into creative outcomes, it's probably not going to happen. And so how do you build technology that motivates creative effort? That's really interesting. And so as an analogy, I was thinking about Nike's social media application, Nike Plus Run. And it's one of my favorite ones. And what you can do with this before you go on a run is you can invoke the application and put a link onto your Facebook page, and people can cheer you on. And I suppose in the headphones it's like, go, 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 right? Having been a runner in my earlier years, I would find that really motivating. What is the equivalent for design thinking? On that rhetorical note, sorry for the cliffhanger, I'm going to conclude. And I've made a number of contributions to design thinking tools for individuals, for groups, and for communities. I talked about the work we've done on spatial maps. We developed visualizations to help extract meaning from prior activity. We showed how to use non-expert crowds to generate feedback on preliminary designs. And we talked about some results and a tool that supports consensus building in online communities. And so thanks for your attention. I can take questions now. Michael.
So I've got a question about Voyant. I wonder if this approach could be extended to not just sort of the subjective or perceptual feedback, but also to give me a more grounded sense of how well I'm doing. You could imagine, for example, anchoring the system with a number of designs that have sort of known quality bars, and then through a process of sort of comparison, show me sort of quantitatively, your design is sort of sitting here on this scale. So now I'm either, if I want to have this bar, I need to work harder, or I'm actually overachieving. Like, I wonder if there are ways to give people more direct or quantitative feedback about how they're doing.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think there absolutely is. And so one of the ways is just do it through iteration. And just like if you're doing an interaction design, is you do the first one to create a baseline, and then you do the subsequent iterations to compare to what your original one was, and see if you're going in the right direction. I think you can do the same thing here. And so on multiple iterations, or even if you want to do an exploration at certain points, you can compare and contrast if you're improving. So one of the things that I really want to do is I'm really sensitive to engendering trust into the system. And if you make what you think to be really good improvements on your design, and it comes back as having worse feedback, you're going to call into question whether or not that's meaningful or not. So what I really want to do is try to help people elaborate what the changes are, look and see if the crowd gives you an improved response, and then compare that to the changes that you said that you made. And hopefully give people confidence that the system's actually recognizing when you make improvements.
So that seems dependent on the crowd being consistent enough in their feedback.
Yes,
Have you seen that to be the case?
Well, we're kind of doing that right now.
Yeah.
And so we really want to check the consistency, because my concern is that if it appears to be a random process, I mean, what's the perception from the purpose of the user? They're not really going to have a lot of confidence in the system. So I want to give them confidence that we give them consistent feedback. And if they actually make improvements, that the crowd recognizes that those improvements were made.
It seems like the variance would depend on the task. Like if you flash the thing at me, I think you get some very consistent responses about the first thing people notice.
Sure.
Whereas other tasks here might have a much wider variance. Subjectivity.
Well, there are a lot of number of different kind of applications that have kind of popped up that do roughly similar things, but when I look at them, they all do it in a different way. And what that tells me that we don't really know how to do this very well yet. And so hopefully we can kind of discover some principles and communicate that, and they get engendered in some of these other tools. Yeah. Please.
So for the Voyant one, that like part where you like identify like negative words and then like just highlight them. Did you take a look at like what the actual like before and after was? Like, so like suppose somebody like wanted to post something that was like, this is a terrible idea. Like, what did they actually change it to?
Okay, so first of all, that was the proceed system.
Okay.
But I get it. Yeah. So he's asking about whether or not when we highlight the words, do people actually make changes?
Yeah. Like, what kind of changes did they make? Did they just like replace terrible with a word that you won't highlight, or did they actually like change it into like constructive criticism?
I wish I had a data point on that. I do not have a data point on that yet. But hopefully I can come back and give you a data point. Will people make changes? I actually think that they will. But I don't know how suggested that we need to be. Right now I'm very I don't want to make interpretations for them. I want them to come to their own conclusion that they need to make an adjustment. But I think they will. I really do. I'm very optimistic about that. Because when you see it and it's in front of you and you look at all the different words that I've highlighted, it has just kind of a visceral kind of impact on you. It's like, wow, I'm really not being very positive. And so you might go back and change it. And there's, we know that, from reviews and doing reviews, we know that there's ways to say things exactly the same way, but it's more constructive. And that's what I really want people to do. I mean, you have to change what you say, just make it more constructive in the way that you communicate it to the other person. And it's really important because that social process is such a key element. It's so easy to leave that community that if you get frustrated and you're upset about what somebody says, you can just leave and not come back. But yet it depends on people, their willingness to volunteer. So I think it's an important component. Yeah, please.
I think it's on the same scale. So about the consensus thing, you said that you asked people to say on a scale of how positive or how negative they are about the idea. I was wondering how you incorporate that into the design of how you're going to show this. So I've seen designs where they put, these are the pros of this idea, these are the cons, and you split it into two parts of the screen, and then there are the normal forums that just come one after the other. And this one, it's easier to see the pros and cons on one. The other one, it's easier to follow the discussion. I was wondering how you kind of incorporate these two.
Well, of course, there's many different solution possibilities that one has here, right? And so, we had one that we thought was effective, but we'd be open to changing it. But we map your disposition. In other words, if you like it or not, we map it to space, right? So the top channel gives you what people, the people who like it, and the bottom channel gives you those who do not or want to be constructive. So we just map it onto space to be direct about your question. No, not two different parts of the screen. Not two different
I'm
parts.
wondering how people can follow the discussion.
Right there. So the top row are supportive. The bottom row here are those that are constructive. Okay, and that gets repeated for each of the ideas. So it's mapped onto space. There's 3 channels. Okay, and so we're trying to be consistent for each idea. And what you want to do is compare and contrast these. So you can look for things that if you don't have anything in the bottom row, that means that people are very supportive if there's a lot on the top. If there's an equal number top and bottom, and there's a lot of them, that means there's tension and conflict. If there's only things on the bottom and nothing on the top row, that means that, well, maybe that's not really going to go anywhere. And then the ones that are rendered a little bit larger, wow, I really either really do like this or I really don't. And it calls attention to it. That's what we're trying to do. Because it's so easy to miss comments in the discussion. And you feel as if I said something, nobody's listening to me. Here we call it out. So if you really don't support it or you really do, it's apparent.
This is really great. So if the person goes to the discussion, they'll see the normal forum kind of discussion coming one after the other, and then on the overview they can see what the positive and how.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Gilbert.
I just wanted to mention a possible suggestion for the sense analysis, where you're highlighting the negative words.
Yes. Ours is very simplistic, so suggestions would be welcome.
Oh, I mean, it seems like since you have the forum, it'd be great to simply look at before and after the introduction of this feature.
Yeah.
What's the statistical change in language being used, which is maybe not the desired effect.
Yeah, I love that idea. And it comes back, I love the idea. Yeah, I love the idea. And it comes back to the question I had about how do you measure the impact of a tool like this in the community? And just measuring the number of things that reach consensus may not be the right approach. And so what you're talking about is a change in the way that people converse about ideas. That's a really big change. And so if we could show that here, I think that would be fantastic. It's just how long does that change, how long does it take? It's probably not going to be immediate. And so we have to follow this for a long period of time.
So that's the overview or visualization of the post or discussion as a whole. Have you been thinking about within the conversation, within the forums, maybe just pull out the negative sense or positive sense without just when they're posted you're marking it blue or red, but people can visually get through the discussion so get a better sense within the context?
I'm not sure if I completely followed what you said about this, but we're certainly open to doing many different things in the way that the discussion is visualized. We don't necessarily think this is the final right solution. It's more of just of a prototype and a way to allow us to probe what people really want in that community and then be responsive to that and try to iterate on the design. So if certainly other things come up like that, we'd be happy to incorporate it. Yeah.
It seems like Voyant can be used for A/B testing. How would you say Voyant is different from traditional A/B testing? Is it because you get more structured feedback?
Well, it's different than A/B testing. I think what we're doing is we're making the feedback really cheap. And so now what you can do is you can engage crowds through your local workspace. So literally with a pull down, say in Photoshop, you can engage that crowd. And now it probably costs too much, it takes too long, but what if we can do this in a couple of hours and get you feedback 3 to 4 times a day? That's where we really want to go. And so we're making the feedback really inexpensive to get. And so now when you try out different things, you can immediately test it and then use that to have very tight iterations. I think that's really exciting.
We have time for maybe one more question. Silence means okay.
Okay.
We got one right before the end.
A small question about the design. I see there's plus signs here. Does this mean that if I see the design and something comes to mind, then I can quickly just add a positive or negative comment about it?
Yeah, that's exactly what you can do. And so what we want to do is not just think about a visualization as output, but think about the visualization as input. And so we can offer some constraints through this way. And so this is where we have this constraint that if you have a newly submitted idea that has no comments yet, then the first one needs to be in the top row. That way people see the good of the idea and can read the good about the idea before they start making constructive comments. And the part is, again, about the social process, making people feel better about the discussion. And even if my idea doesn't get picked, well, at least people said something that was positive about it, right?
And on that note?
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Positive notes for